What's up, everybody? This is Aaron the Pedantic. This video comes after a long night of arguments on Twitter. And the reason for the argument is kind of one of those age-old questions that comes up. Are we really playing a story game whenever we play D&D? Now, I am a hardline no. Is you are playing D&D in the way that it's written. Now, what I mean by a story game, and we have to get these definitions out of the way, otherwise people are going to get endlessly caught up into like a game of semantics and seeing past each other and all this kind of thing, to me, a story game has a very distinct role for the players as opposed to the games that are role-playing games that people tend to call story games because they say, well, we created a story. So the player in a role-playing game, the ultimate question is, what do you do? You are playing a role. You are the character. You do not have authorship over the setting in any way other than just saying like maybe where your character came from. Once the game starts, that is the end of that transaction. You are done with all of the setting details. You basically are just going to be that character in that setting. You're going to purely be that person. So you inhabit that mind space. You act in a way that is fit for that character or fit for how you think the group needs in order for things to carry on. This is why whenever I make my characters, I tend to make them a personality type and, like with just very scant details about their past. Usually there's some kind of very mechanical need for certain things. This is how backgrounds in 5th edition are useful. So that is to me a role-playing game. Now, in order to get into what I consider a story game, you need to start giving some authorship on the setting to the players. And it's a sliding scale. There are games that do this to varying degrees. But the important distinction is that if you ever ask them what happens next, which is entirely different from what do you do, then that is whenever you're getting over into story territory. So, but it's like I said, it's a sliding scale. Now, the reason that I think that we should not call D&D a story game is because there are games that specifically have in the mechanics what happens next. Okay, so this involves such things as PBTAs, powered by the apocalypse. This involves the storyteller. Oh, I did not mean to hit that. This involves the storyteller system, from what I've heard. I'm not a proponent or player of the storyteller system. That would be the White Wolf games, those kinds of things. And this would more fittingly involve a game like Polaris. So I have looked into Polaris. The thing that you do, basically, there is no game master. So that should be kind of hint number one. If there's no game master, it's probably a story game in some capacity because everybody is controlling the setting in some way. So first off, there's no game master. Secondly, your roles, like as a player, your roles are related to introducing plot twists and story elements. It's not related to controlling what your character does. It is a negotiation process based on the rules of the system that say who gets to control the narrative. So extremely narrative focused. Okay. So it doesn't really bother me so much whenever people are going to say we're doing a story game or we're doing collaborative storytelling if they play D&D but they use a lot of those narrative elements like that. For instance, you might use the I have a friend here kind of mechanic. So it's basically you're able to say, oh wait, I have a connection at this place. This is their name. This is what. So anytime that you're kind of going back and explaining what has happened or is in the world as a player, that's breaching into story territory, and it's not always a bad thing. I'm not some kind of anti-story evangelist. I've actually enjoyed using these elements. If you watch my video on King of Dungeons, that uses narrative elements to abbreviate things that people aren't interested in with dungeon crawlers or with adventure games. So I'm not against these things inherently, but I enjoy I appreciate using what I consider to be accurate definitions so that whenever we come to the table and we are going to say, all right, we're going to play Dungeons and Dragons, the role-playing game, that we can basically say, all right, so we're not doing that stuff. All right, we're not doing that kind of thing. If somebody comes up and they say, well, I kind of want to use these elements or whatever, that's whenever you are playing the story game, or whenever you are using collaborative storytelling. You're not using collaborative storytelling by saying what your character does, rolling the dice, and seeing what result occurs. Randomness is not an element of storytelling. Randomness can be a measure of filling gaps in, but it's not a measure of storytelling. It often is counter to the process of storytelling, because whenever you tell a story, there is a purpose behind it. So to me, the only story that erupts out of D&D as it's written is the story that you tell your friends about what happened at your table. You don't tell a story by living your life. And that's basically what you do as a player, is you live a life. As a DM, you foster an environment. Now you create a world, and then you put them in the world and you give them the opportunity to have exciting experiences, but you're not telling a story. Some people make the argument that you basically have stories in your world because you have these characters with backgrounds. You have plot elements that you've thought of, those kinds of things, and there may be some truth to that. But the problem is that if you are looking at your game in terms of, I have a plot here, then you end up having two choices. Either they go on the plot as you decided beforehand, and everything goes according to plan, or they don't go to the plot. They don't go through the plot, and then you either force them into the plot still, or you evolve the game as you go. Now, if you're doing the second one, that is still role-playing. But if you force or use illusionism to make your plot still happen, you're basically playing a story game for yourself, and you're forcing others to go along with it, whether they know it or not. I've been subject to that kind of treatment before, and I hate it. This is one of the reasons that I was adamantly against any kind of story talk with games for a while. Like, anytime somebody just brought it up, I'm like, fuck that. I'm not here for that. I want to play my character in this world. I want to have experiences, but I don't want anything to be restricting me in such a way that I can't express that I have no agency as a player. And if you watch my last video, player agency is sacred to me. So whenever you have a DM who is trying to use a role-playing game as a story game, they tend to take away player agency in order to fulfill these grand plots that they've conceived. I could probably go on to this for hours. But this is kind of like the crux of what I wanted to get across. It is a useful definition when we just say role-playing game, and whenever we use that separately from story game. So I'm not doing it because I want to exclude people from the hobby. There are some people that will. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. Some people are assholes. Sometimes I'm an asshole. But I don't say, listen, you're not playing a role-playing game at that point because I want to exclude people from the role-playing game hobby. I want more people to be involved. But at the same time, there are situations I've seen where people say, all right, we're going to play D&D. Awesome, cool. Everybody gets together, and then half of the people there are completely unsatisfied because they want the role-playing game or they want the story game, and they're getting the thing that they don't want. So I think it's very important for us to use these definitions to try and say, what do I want from this game? And for people to try and organize their groups in such a way that they are going to have the things that they want satisfied. And like I said, it is a spectrum. Whenever it comes to the things people tend to want, it's kind of a Venn diagram, So it's not just a, black or white kind of situation. There are a lot of players that can go to either table and they'll probably have a good time. But it is a matter of like what you want to highlight in the game. And there are certain things that if you highlight them, people are going to leave. So a clear line for a lot of newer players that are not interested in the more immersive role-playing mechanics would be people that are averse to rations, encumbrance, like keeping track of time, light sources, all of these kinds of things. They would be averse to character death in high volumes. They just don't play for that. So whenever you are putting that upon them, they're going to be like, oh, fuck no. I don't want to do this. They're going to find another group. Meanwhile, the person who enjoys those things, if they go to the story group that isn't at all interested in those things, they're like, well, this is an entire part of the game that I'm not really getting to experience, and I want to experience that. So this would be if like the game is entirely focused on the combat element, or I keep hitting things, or entirely focused on the narrative element, or like just strictly social encounters. You have to know what your game is about. And it's not just a matter of what kinds of encounters you have. Because if you say, wow, there's a lot of exploration in my game, but whenever you do the exploration, you aren't using a lot of those elements, then somebody might just be like, you're not really doing role playing though. You're really just kind of like doing set piece encounters, It's just like, oh, this happens. Oh, this happens. It's just, definitions are important. So is finding out what you like and trying to make sure that what you're getting people to your table for is something that they also like. So I am learning to be more and more explicit about what my game is. At least I'm trying to. And if I'm going to play in a different way, I try to be more explicit about it. So that's what I did whenever I ran a very story-based game last go around. There's some episodes of it, and they're terrible if you want to watch or listen. And currently I'm running games that are extremely immersive role-playing games where if you try to, do any kind of authorship of the game as a player, then I'm going to say, fuck off. Like, that's not what we're doing here. We're doing role-playing. So, anyway, that's the video. Have a good one.